So you give them a handicap because it forces them to bid more. This sort of discrimination works exactly like the standard price discrimination that that we were talking about. Basically what it does is it allows us to increase the total probability that we sell the good, because, imagine, yesterday I was talking about reserve prices. You might want to put a reserve price to raise your price. But I might not want to put a high reserve price for Alex to win because I don't think he's willing to pay very much. But I want to put a high reserve price for Ben to win because I think he's willing to pay more. So effectively by doing this I can say, well, Alex, you can win at a low price, but then you should bid really aggressively and force Ben to pay a high price if he wants to win. So that's how you discriminate in auction.
You mean forces others to beat them by a lot?
Where did I say that?
The second bullet point. Up.
Yeah, not just to beat them, but to beat them by a lot. Sorry. Yeah. So this will lead to inefficiency, right? High value bidders will lose more often. But that's exactly the same as what we said with second degree price discrimination, right? There, the whole point was that you make the lower class crappy in order to try to force the guys to bid higher, in order to force them to pay more. So similarly, there will be inefficient times when someone who values it more loses, but that forces them to bid higher. And so on average, that can make you more money. And you can apply the sort of pass-through analysis to figure out whether this is a good or a bad thing, whether this improves or reduces welfare and so forth. Yeah, Mike?
I actually don't really see how the high-value bidders would try to win the auction. Because
yeah.
It's like,
well, they're willing to pay more, right? So they value getting the object more, right? And so clearly they're going to bid higher than the low-value bidders on average if you had non-discriminatory rules, right? So if you now make them slightly discriminatory against them, they're still going to keep bidding higher. I mean, they might be slightly deterred from doing that, but they're still going to keep bidding higher, right? And at some point you're going to get down and they're not going to be willing to bid that much higher, right? But that's going to be your optimal point, and that involves some discrimination. And that's exactly at the point where the elasticities are in the right ratio to one another, just as in the third degree price discrimination.
it just seems like if you apply the handicap, right, then the low value bidders, when they bid more aggressively, when they get to their optimal point, then it would increase a lot higher at a rate.
Yeah.
And the high value bidders would be willing to bid. So
no, I mean, you can clearly do too much handicapping, right? Which is what you're pointing out. But the point is, a little bit of handicapping is always going to be beneficial, right? Like if I'm sure, I mean, imagine an extreme case. Imagine I'm certain that Ben is willing to pay 10, and John, I don't know how much he's willing to pay, right? So in order to get Ben to pay his full 10, I should say that John wins at any price other than 10. So in other words, if you bid anything below 10, then John automatically wins. And that'll force you to bid 10. And that'll be better for us, right? I mean, that's a very extreme case, but that general logic is right.
So how does that, so like you use the example of the airlines before, right?
Yeah.
So you want to lower the price of coach, but raise the price of first class, but you want to do it at a level where the person who wants to be first class, so they're willing to pay because
yes.
But if a coach gets too cheap, then even the person in first class will be like, this is too cheap, not this.
Exactly. Yeah. Go ahead, Steve.
I was just wondering, how would that work in a practical example? Because for the auctions, would that be comparable to the airlines? I don't really see how.
Well, I mean, the most common example of this sort of thing is that when the government does procurement auctions between different agencies, like different competitors, usually they give advantages to new companies that they think probably aren't as up to competing with the other companies to try to force the other companies to bid low. Basically, there wouldn't be much competition for those big companies unless they sort of subsidize people to compete with them, and that's sort of what they're doing. They're sort of subsidizing people to compete with them in the auction. Okay, so on Tuesday we're going to talk a lot more about redistributive taxation, but the goal of redistributive taxation is really very similar to the monopoly problem, which is that we want to raise revenue in order to redistribute it to the poor. Basically because of some sort of from each according to his ability to each according to his need idea. But if we tax people, that leads them not to work very hard, right? And So we could solve that problem if we could tax people based on how much they can earn rather than how much they currently are earning, right? This would be like first-degree price discrimination, right? We charge everyone how much they're willing to, pay rather than charging people based on something they actually do. So that would obviously be more efficient, but in the absence of that, where you have to use imperfect forms of price discrimination. So one thing we can do is just like a progressive tax, we can just charge different people at different income levels different tax rates, right? And we'll talk more about that on Tuesday. But another thing you can do is you can put people into some categories based on observable characteristics of them, which is more like third-degree price discrimination, right? So for example, we can charge higher taxes to people with higher earning potential. And this will allow us to redistribute more from the people who have high earning potential to the people who have less earning potential, but have low tax rates on the margin, right? And therefore not discourage work very much. And that's exactly the same logic as third-degree price discrimination, right? We just force certain people to pay more, but then we charge them low rates for additional amounts of the thing. So one obvious category for this is height. There's an extremely strong link in the data between being tall and earning more income. I think a male who's like 6'2", on average, holding every other thing constant, earns about $5,000 a year more than someone who's my height. And so, here's the distribution. So, here are different hourly wages, and as you see, tall people are under, this is short, on the left is short, this gray thing, white is medium, and black is tall, and as you see, tall people just earn much higher wages than short and medium height people.
What happened at $25 an hour?
What happened? Yeah, that's weird. And so this is a little bit silly in some ways, but it very much is in the logic of third-degree price discrimination, right? We want to charge more to people who are willing to pay more, who are able to earn more, right? But there's lots of policy areas that follow this type of an idea that are really very practical. So, and there's a basic trade-off here. On the one hand, you don't want to tax activities that people can really change. So if people could stunt their growth in order to stop from paying this tax, then you really wouldn't want to be taxing height. But on the other hand, to the extent that you can tax height and people can't change it, just like people can't probably change whether they're a senior, you're going to be able to charge lower prices and therefore have lower taxes, have people work harder, and yet still achieve the same amount of redistribution. And many areas of public policy can be interpreted this way. So one example is affirmative action. Why do we have affirmative action on the basis of race rather than income? Well, you could be afraid that it would be a disincentive to parents to earn money if they thought that by being poor, they could get their kid into a better college, right? Whereas nobody can choose whether to be white or black based on where it's going to get their kid into college, right? And so price discrimination, completely forgetting about anything about economic, racial or whatever, or the history, just the fact that you can't change your race indicates that it might make a lot of sense to have affirmative action based on race. Another example is there's lots of very complicated deductions in the tax code, like aid to handicapped people, aid to single mothers, aid to the unemployed, etc. And those are because those things are relatively hard for people to change. And so we think that giving people money who are in that situation is a way of giving money to people who are likely to be poor without discouraging them from working, right? If we just gave them money because they were poor and then taxed it away as they got wealthier, then they wouldn't want to work. But if we give money to you just because you're a single mother, that doesn't discourage you from working.
But it does discourage you from getting married.
It does discourage you from getting married, so that can be a problem. Yeah. So if we think that that's less elastic, that margin of adjustment is less elastic, then it makes sense to discriminate on that. If it doesn't, then we don't want to do that. So, So I think that economists have had a tendency to sort of instinctively oppose any of these special breaks or deductions. But that's really a little bit silly, because it's exactly the same as the logic of third-degree price discrimination, which we apply all the time. So the key is exactly the question that Ben posed, which is a great question, which is which of these things are more elastic, right? If not getting married is very elastic, you definitely don't want to give subsidies to single mothers. But if it's less elastic, you may well want to do that. This seems to a lot of people to violate some sort of equity and the second welfare theorem, which says we should just focus on redistributing. But really, it's very much in that spirit of the second welfare theorem. It's trying to get as directly as possible without distorting how much you're working at redistributing between people. Okay. I think one particularly interesting application of this is the criminal justice system. So Gary Becker argued famously that this was just like the monopoly problem, because enforcement, putting people in jail, stuff like this are costly activities for society, because we have to spend money on policing and so forth. And therefore, the more elastic people are to, the more that our punishing them deters them from committing crimes, the more it makes sense to invest in punishing them. It doesn't make sense to invest in punishing them, regardless of how much they respond. It only makes sense to invest in punishing them if we know they're going to respond. So what we want to do is to put the most punishment on people who are going to respond most to us punishing them. And so this means that we should practice third-degree price discrimination, that different sorts of people should receive different types of punishments. And Victor Liu, can you give some examples of ways in which the criminal justice system, in fact, treats people in different elasticity circumstances differently? Anyone else have any idea? Yeah, Federico.
Like if you help find other criminals or somebody you were working with, then that means you're probably not so loyal.
Well, that might be one reason. What do you think, Michael?
On a basic level, like the seriousness of the offense.
Well, but that's more like the cost that you impose. So I want something that has to do with elasticity. Cody, what do you think?
For younger kids?
Yeah,
So
that's a
if
great
you're 12 and you rob a store,
Yeah, we think most kids don't really think about their future. They don't really anticipate the consequences of their actions, and therefore they're not going to respond to the fact that they're going to get punished. They're just going to do it because they got dared to do it or something like that, right? And so, age of offenders. We usually give lighter sentences to younger kids because we don't think they plan that much. They don't anticipate the future. The degree of a murder. There's first-degree murder, second-degree murder, third-degree murder, manslaughter. That's based on the fact that we think people who are very intentional and made a very detailed plan are people who would respond to being punished. Other people would respond less. Temporary insanity defense is exactly this. We think if someone was temporarily insane, the prospect of them being punished would do nothing to deter them from the crime, right? So that's the whole basis of the temporary insanity defense. So the more general lesson that this teaches us is that when we think about how we interact with other people, if it's costly for us to punish them, we're going to want to think about their intentions, right? We're not just going to want to think about did they do something bad to us, we're going to think what was their intention, because if their intention was one thing, then they might be deterred from our potential, later activity. Yeah, Michael?
Oh, I was gonna say,
Yeah.
it seems a little bit after if you apply these types of adjustments, it seems like for example for age of offender, right?
Yeah.
It's more youth crime because of the lighter sentencing. So how does adjusting for this type of discrimination affect that?
Well, if the youth don't respond to punishment, then that's not true. If the youth do respond to punishment, then that is true, but it's exactly the same as the logic that we said. So there's still going to be this distortion, because in the high market there's going to be too little, so there's going to be an increased dead weight loss as a result of you doing the discrimination. But it's still better, it's still less costly than not following that policy. Yeah. Great, guys. So good luck studying for the midterm. Definitely come to lecture on Tuesday. Read